Open source is one of those classic models where it feels like it should be. It is free or should be free. No software is free. People have to build, operate, and maintain the software.
Hi, this is your host Apil Bhartiya and welcome to topic of this month for 2024. And today we have with us Rob Hirschfeld, CEO of RackN. And today we are going to talk about cost optimization. Rob, it's great to have you on the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. This is a really significant topic, so I'm happy to cover it.
When I was recording this whole prediction video series, cost was a topic that almost came up with every prediction. So I'm like, this is very well timed. So we are not talking about the cost which is associated with running. It doesn't matter what kind of business you're running, but we are looking at some unexpected sources of cost. So what are those?
RackN deals with infrastructure. And so we help companies that are focused on the infrastructure side of the IT equation, which is where a lot of this cost comes from, right? People and are probably the major component that most people see. And then the other side of it is actually using infrastructure, either buying infrastructure or renting infrastructure. And interestingly enough, those two costs often intersect, although in unusual ways. But the most unexpected place for people is, they really have a difficult time planning out how much cloud infrastructure they're going to end up consuming. We hear this over and over again. They seem to do a better job, or in some cases, they overplan how much infrastructure they have to buy if they're buying infrastructure. And so that typically ends up being the opposite equation. They'll spend a lot of money up front, but then they have more capacity than they expected to have. Cloud is often the opposite. So as people design systems, they have trouble accounting for what the actual utilization of those systems is. And in a lot of cases, that can translate into an architectural challenge that really trips them up. You can see that in serverless infrastructure, where the design of an application, if they committed to serverless, can translate into very expensive serverless costs and applications. It can translate into a resource utilization, especially if they haven't done any refactoring to take advantage of elastic systems. And then a lot of times people expect things to be much more elastic than they actually can be. And so they find that they end up running a lot more infrastructure to support an application or to support application teams than they were expecting. And all those things, individually seem like pretty small problems, but they can add up really quickly. And it can be incredibly difficult to turn the temperature down on some of these infrastructure purchases and rentals when those costs start to add up.
Excellent, thank you. And since you brought up kind of comparison, not exact comparison, that cost of running things in cloud versus running your own infrastructure, data center, colo, whatever it is. Can you also talk about when it comes to cost? And we are talking about, once again, unexpected cost. Can you kind of offer a comparison between running on public cloud versus running on your own infrastructure, your own data center, your own, of course, colos?
I think that there's a couple of factors in here that people often conflate when they have this conversation about cloud infrastructure. Without a doubt, there's a cloud architecture, which involves dynamic, automated, API-driven consumption of infrastructure. That has nothing to do with the cost model for cloud. Cloud itself is right. Cloud architectures and using cloud behaviors, you can do that on any type of infrastructure. And I think we often get confused about that when people say, well, I need to go to cloud because I need to do that infrastructure. That there's no need to be in a cloud service provider from that perspective. And one of the things I think we've seen over and over again is that companies that move into cloud infrastructure think that they're giving up a lot of the management, the responsibility for that infrastructure. And it isn't actually the case. Companies that are moving into the cloud infrastructure systems still have to own the operational constructs. They don't have to own some of the bare, buying the servers, the procurement, renting the space, things like that. A lot of those things actually aren't very difficult and don't take a lot of overhead. That's what we see in our customers. They scale those services very well, or they have partners who absorb that work very effectively. But they still end up having a lot of the operational expertise. They have to understand how the cloud is, built. They have to take into account of the restrictions of how that cloud is built. Those things actually often surprise companies where they thought that they were going to be getting out of the operations game altogether, and they thought they could, whittle away their operations teams. What they find in cloud, especially when they come to cost optimize the cloud infrastructure, is that their operations burdens are comparable to what they had before. And because you actually have to pay attention to consumption in the cloud, you have operations burdens that you might not have had if you just bought the infrastructure. So you can be in a case where cloud infrastructure is typically more expensive per unit, especially over time. It only is cost effective if you're able to throttle back, expand, and adapt that infrastructure. If you're thinking you're going to get a discount on servers because the cloud provider buys them cheaper than you can, that they do, but they don't sell them to you cheaper. And in fact, they're renting them. And so you're paying for that server over its lifetime many, many, many times. And so it is not actually a cost. They're not passing that cost savings on to you over the life of the server. You are responsible for having dynamic workloads that allow you to scale back your workload dynamically and leave them with a server that they have to find another use for. If you can't do that, then you don't get the pricing benefits. And to do that well, you have to have the operational capabilities and all the tooling, the observability, the architectures, all of the pieces and parts that go into that work to take advantage of it. So I think a lot of companies underestimate, they assume that the savings that people can realize from cloud are built into the cloud, and they're not. They're available in the cloud, but they are not inherent in using the cloud by itself. You have to make an investment in effort to do that. And we've seen this many, many times. That investment is a time people investment. It's a distraction from operating your infrastructure. And you could pull back, buy equipment, which is actually relatively affordable, or lease equipment, which is even less capital intensive, and then not have to worry about those types of dynamic workload consideration.
When it comes to data center, beyond compute, what are the other, because we mostly talk about cloud, compute, but networking is there, storage is there. Talk about what are the other aspects which can also have an impact on cost.
One of the other places where people get surprise bills is on data storage and data transit. One of the things about cloud is you pay every month for the data that you're storing, and it can be very hard to eliminate storage. People often generate much more storage than they think they're going to have. And then transiting that storage between clouds or into different applications can become incredibly expensive. And so, that is a very hard thing to estimate as you're building applications or moving them into cloud. And once they're there, they can be stuck. They can be, trapped into that cloud and very expensive to move things away from that cloud infrastructure. And that becomes a very significant component for making decisions like that. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Google recently did that is a head scratcher, but makes sense in this context, is they eliminated the departure fees for customers. So one of the ways that they can mitigate the risk of using Google's infrastructure is by saying, if it doesn't work out for you, you can leave for free instead of being trapped and have to move your data out at high expense. And on the surface, it seems strange that they're giving away things for free for people who are leaving, but that is a major calculation for people taking the risk of using a different infrastructure. They have to be able to know they can vacate the infrastructure, they can switch vendors. And so there was a pretty savvy move, I think, for Google.
Now, since we are talking about cloud, or whether you look at data centers, today's world literally kind of, in a way or other, runs on open source software. We have had this discussion before also. Open source can easily solve the one problem. You can download the code, you can get it started for free, but there is a cost associated with running it. And that's why there is a very vibrant, booming ecosystem around open source. Open source is successful because of the commercialization. So cost is there as well. how can one not only assess the cost associated with using open source and how they can also kind of tame or control that?
Open source is one of those classic models where it feels like it should be. It is free or should be free. No software is free. People have to build, operate, and maintain the software. So somebody, unless we're talking about true labors of love, somebody somewhere has to maintain that software. And if you're a business, there is no way you should be using software that is not being actively maintained. It is a absolutely critical component to have active maintenance in that software. And if it's being actively maintained, you need to be investing in the people who are doing that work or the company that's doing that work. So, I think that companies pursuing open source software, and I'm a big fan of open source software, I'm also a little bit skeptical because I think we rely on lots of open source without understanding how it's monetized and what the strategy is. And in 2023, we saw a ton of open source companies change license models, find trouble, have to make adjustments in order to some people would say protect or change open source, but in a lot of cases, the economics are such that, products that are being used more broadly require a lot of maintenance. That's part of how the market works. And so, I really encourage companies who are using a lot of IT infrastructure, software, and applications to not look at open source as free. They should be looking at vendored relationships. And if it's open behind the scenes, that means they may be able to change vendors for a product behind the scenes. But the reality of even open source, if you're getting vendored open source software, which I'm recommending you do, your actual ability to switch vendors, even if it's open source under the covers, might be pretty limited. So what I would suggest doing is looking at the open source commitments and investments that you've been making, participate in the communities that are important to you, find vendors that you can trust, and then build relationships with the vendors to make sure that they are sustaining it. And ultimately, you're going to do better with open source if you treat it at the enterprise level as product purchases, right? Where you have a relationship and there's support and you think of it as a product rather than free software that you're getting. And we see this over and over again. Companies end up having very connected integrations into open source products that don't have support. And in today's fast-moving security environments, and we see this, right? We use Golang. Golang has security vulnerabilities that come out on a monthly basis. That you need to rebuild and repackage the applications, which we do as a vendor all the time. And if you don't have a committed relationship to help you do that, it doesn't matter. The software is not free, and if it's not secure, insecure software is actually very expensive for your organization.
While you're talking about open source, it kind of also not exactly falls in the bracket of a lot of companies. They like to do things yourself, DIY, and they do feel at times that since they are not using a vendor, DIY is more or less like free. But once again, going to find investing too much
talk. Go ahead.
Yeah. So talk about the cost which is actually associated with DIY, and those costs can once again pile up.
This is one of those things that DIY can feel free because the people you're paying people's salaries, but of the costs that we're talking about, the actual salaries for people is much more expensive. And the opportunity costs of what those people are doing is even more expensive for your organization. And we see this all the time. It's very tempting to have somebody say, oh, I can do this. I can build it with open source parts and then create something bespoke for our company that meets our needs exactly. In IT and infrastructure, there are very, very few places where your company has bespoke IT needs. I as an infrastructure company, I can tell you There are not that many vendors selling servers. There are not that many operating systems. There are not that many configurations of operating systems, or there shouldn't be. What we see is every company's implemented something that is unique and custom and special that is actually not providing any business value to them. But they have people who have to support that, have to maintain it, they have backlogs and roadmaps. They have to maintain these platforms. And that means that you have to maintain that expertise in-house. It means that you don't get the benefit of industry advances because that one person or that team has to implement those changes. And it also means that that team is not doing innovative work that's specific to your business. They're literally just turning the wheel. They're doing what I would consider toil in industry work that every other people in the industry are already doing or have done. And if you're paying people to do work that could be routinized or standardized, which a lot of IT work should be able to be, then you're literally you're just burning money. Now it's going to cost you something to bring in a vendor to do that work and have a partner to do it. And this is why it's an opportunity cost problem. You can pay people to do work that you could find a vendor for. But it's not particularly value-added work. Just like racking and stacking servers, there's a lot of vendors who would include that as part of a server purchase. It's not a particularly good use of your people's time at this point. Just like building and maintaining infrastructure platforms and some of the pieces that go on top of that, those are things that are becoming and have been routinized, as in the routine and standard, and you can get them out of the box. Following those processes is actually a much better way to go. It takes the burden off of your team, not just to build that technology, but then maintain it, keep it up to date and follow best practices, which actually accelerates you much more quickly. So a lot to unpack in all those pieces, but I think companies do a really poor job of thinking through not just the costs of do it yourself, but the opportunity costs of do it yourself. And from an IT leader's perspective, those are really what the questions are. It's not, can we do this, but what are we not doing because we are doing it?
Whether we look at, of course, hosting yourself data centers, or we look at cloud, having resources sitting there not fully being utilized, does that also add up to the cost? Because that's what I hear all the time, that you bought a service and it's not even being fully utilized. Talk about that aspect and how much people are aware of it.
There's a couple of symptoms for this, and SaaS definitely contributes. So if you're buying software on a subscription basis and you're not using the capability that you've paid for, that's definitely a sunk cost where you're not taking advantage of the capabilities of the products that you're building. And we see that happen quite a bit. We see that happen. There's a challenge where people buy servers and then they sit idle. They feel like they've wasted that investment, or and there's a capital expense for that. Having a strategy to get high utilization and high effectiveness out of systems is a really good way to improve outcomes and improve ROI for it. One of the things, this might be counterintuitive for people, but what we find is if you want to improve utilization, the more you can turn things over. This is a very cloud mentality, but it's going to be true of any type of infrastructure. The more dynamic you can be in how you consume infrastructure, how you build teams, how you actually deliver software, the faster your turn rate, usually that enables you to achieve higher utilizations and be more predictive of what you're doing. And so this slow and careful approach to turn things on, turn things off, is not automated. When you turn around and look at a much more dynamic, automated approach to building things, that actually it takes some effort to build that in. Sometimes you can lean on vendors and follow their standards and processes that get you down the field further. But the further you get into that type of automated pipelining strategy, that approach, the more effective your people are, the more collaborative they can be, and the higher utilization rates you're going to get. 100 every time we turn around, that's the utilization rates of the products people use, both software and hardware, goes way up when they've built automated pipelines that transform their speed in delivering. So it's remarkable how many positive checkboxes you get from that type of integrated pipelining approach.
Now let's look at cost from a very holistic perspective, that all the kind of areas that you talked about that can lead to unexpected cost. Is it easy or change? Is it easy or hard to change, this whole, where the cost is adding up? And what are the areas that people often overlook? There are a lot of areas that people are, hey, this is what part of the cost, but there may be a lot of areas that do have an impact on cost, but people don't even look at those areas. So talk about two aspects: how easy or difficult it is to change cost, and then what are the areas that are often overlooked.
We could talk a whole hour on that, and I've been doing some fun research and speaking on something I've been calling the compliance death curve, exactly about this topic. It can be very hard organizationally to do this work, because what we've done for the last 10 years is we've built a lot of silos and empowered teams to make independent decisions. And we've created this problem where we have a lot of teams that are not collaborating well, aren't working well together, aren't incented to work well together. And so what we really need to think through is how we are building a integrated process for our teams. And that is, it's hard. It's easy to say. It's easy to say, you know what, I actually need my teams to be working together better. I need them to be following standards. I need to be enforcing some type of joint governance across all my teams. That work can be very difficult. Teams resist that type of work. They have to be given a budget for collaboration. They have to be given incentives to collaborate across the organization and break down those silos. And it's really remarkable just how much that the organizational design that we've created. Sometimes we've sold tools into that further entrench these silos. And this team-oriented application. We really do need to be thinking through, how do we coordinate across teams much better? How do we take shared burden away from teams? How do we enforce better standards and governance? The compliance death curve idea is really that the work that has to be done at first seems like a drain, a negative work, where you're taking away from teams' autonomy, or you're taking away from decisions they've made. That the reality we've seen over and over and over again is that once standards and shared processes are put in place, where toil can be taken off of teams and where they can be given strong blueprints and templates to do their work, the overall system performance and the individual team performance goes way, way up. That the benefits are very real for that. But you have to have the political capital and the leadership to have the teams, break down the silos, give up some work, follow standards and process. And the good news is right now there's a lot more platforms coming out that make that work easier. Teams are much more open than they have been to reducing their toil or sharing their toil. But it's going to take leadership, direction, and vision of what the outcome should be. You have to be very outcome focused.
Rob, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about this topic. And as usual, I look forward to chatting with you again soon. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.